Welcome everyone to the CCPO-ICAR seminar series. Thank you for joining us today for the seminar titled Community Disaster Recovery, Moving from Vulnerability to Resilience by Dr. Deserai Crow. Associate Professor Crow researches local and state level policy. Her work assesses environmental policy and disaster or crisis policies, including stakeholder participation and influence, information sources used, and policy outcomes in developing policies. Her work often focuses on natural disaster recovery and risk mitigation in local communities. So Professor Crow, I'll let you get us going. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation and the good turnout for my visit today. I first of all have to apologize in advance if you hear any background noise. My kids are on spring break, so in true still COVID, it's never leaving fashion. They are running around the house somewhere. So, but I want to introduce this this talk and with a little bit of context of what this project was and how it came about. Today, I'm going to be talking about a multi-year NSF-funded project on disaster recovery from Colorado's 2013 floods. And my collaborator and good friend, Dr. Elizabeth Albright, who's at Duke, together we collected data, analyzed data for 5 years after the floods. And we just had a book come out in October with the same title with Cambridge University Press. And so it's, you know, when you do a project that's that big and that complex, asking questions about disaster recovery and resilience, in academia, we spend a lot of time publishing journal articles, and we certainly did that, but we wanted to bring the entire story to life because it was such a rich story. We used mixed methods, so both quantitatively and qualitatively, really rich story of disaster recovery and some of the barriers and successes that we saw here in Colorado. And so that's what led us to working on the book project. So today, my goal is to kind of give some highlights of what we found to be the most interesting or important aspects of our research. As we introduced, I'll be talking about my book with Elizabeth Albright, Community Disaster Recovery, Moving from Vulnerability to Resilience. And I want to start by introducing the concept of policy learning. We talk in academia, of course, and generally, we talk so much about learning, but we don't define it very well. And a lot of political scientists and policy scholars like myself talk about governments learning from various external or internal shocks to their system, like disasters or elections or things of that nature that can really change the nature of the institutions or how they understand problems. So learning is thought to be important for governments to change how they do business, change the status quo. And we argue that learning is essential to expecting local governments to move from the status quo to become more resilient after disasters. Now, in the focusing events literature in public policy and political science, we know that focusing events like a disaster can at times draw our attention to policy failures, things that went wrong, things that were in place that we took for granted or that we ignored or didn't fund well, for example. And those might be opportunities for learning. But we also know that oftentimes disasters can be a venue where technocrats and experts kind of dominate the discussion, and there's very little room for the public to become involved. So a lot of literature points to the opportunity for policy change and learning, but also the observation that it does not happen very often or at a very deep level. And I'll talk about what I mean by deep level in a moment. So in the disaster literature, we also know, the mantra that all disasters are local. However, in disaster policy studies, we often do not examine local level municipal governments, county governments. Part of this, I think, is because data collection is tough, and therefore it's more expensive to do than the federal level. But we also know that local government analyses are so important. Not only are they the ones on the ground doing the work of recovery and rebuilding, but those local governments are the ones that are struggling and kind of trying to cope with the tension that often arises after a disaster within their community, where there's a push-pull of people wanting to see different outcomes, different actions by their government. So when I talk about this idea of deeper or more shallow learning, this is an example, and I'm happy to share the slides. You don't have to read all of this, but this is an example of what we refer to as the spectrum of learning within government. So we have categories of learning, like political learning or instrumental learning, where it's really kind of about lesson drawing. We understand, for example, after the floods in Colorado that I'm going to talk about, we saw a number of local governments where they said, you know, one of the earliest things we understood was that we were not prepared in terms of financial procurement or training or even the software required to interface with federal systems. And so we changed that. We instituted new software, we instituted new training, what have you. Now that's an important lesson. So much of rebuilding successfully is being able to work with state and federal government. However, that's pretty shallow. That's a pretty easy lesson to learn when there's, you know, when you have trouble getting money from the feds, it's pretty easy to learn that something went wrong and it needs to be adjusted. When we talk about deeper types of learning, this is here I give two examples of government learning and social learning, where we're understanding that either our government organization or the structure of the organization, the hierarchy or what have you, or the fundamental goals and assumptions of our organization do not adequately address the problems presented by a disaster. So a disaster, you know, might present problems of infrastructure resilience, might present problems of poverty or equity in communities that have long existed before the disaster, but disasters tend to highlight what's already there. And so those deeper levels of learning force an organization, in this case, a government, to really do a little bit of soul searching about what their goals, their understanding of problems and so forth are. So this is a figure that we put together to try to depict the spectrum of learning. This is mapped onto Argyris's single and double loop learning idea, where single loop learning is kind of lesson drawing. It's pretty straightforward. We have an experience, some sort of outcome, and we learn that something didn't go right, or we would like it to go better in the future. So through single loop learning, we adjust our strategies, our tools that we're using. So that's akin to that political or instrumental learning I was mentioning. But with double loop learning, there are some things that only happen when an organization deliberately and systematically establishes a process by which they learn. So it's the learning about learning kind of thing that organizations have to do deliberately. It does not happen accidentally. And so those are the types of lessons, the type of learning that really goes to those fundamental assumptions and goals. So our project really focuses here then, the underlying question that drove us was to understand the processes and arrangements that lead to policies which can reduce community vulnerability to future events, including in our analysis, this includes how policies are formed and decided and what actors can be influential in that process. So this is really what drove us. And I'll say that our guiding questions from the literature on disaster recovery ask whether the type and extent of disaster damage matters, whether public participation matters to disaster recovery, successful disaster recovery and change, whether resources matter, what we had before a disaster and what we bring to bear after, And then we also do some analyses of risk perceptions, causal understanding of the floods, and so forth. So I'm going to highlight a few of these today. But in disaster studies, we have this oversimplified disaster cycle that we often talk about. And the reality of a disaster is much more nuanced than this 4-phase cycle. But I think it's a useful way to understand kind of where our research is focused. So with disasters at the top of the circle, we focus a lot of attention and resources in the US on preparedness. And that's particularly true when we're talking about security threats. So post 9/11 era, we spent a lot of money on preparedness for security threats. But then in some instances, we still prepare through FEMA and their NIM system and incident command system structure and so forth for all hazards. And so for governments to be prepared for anything that might happen in their jurisdiction. Then the event happens, and that's where an incredible amount of public attention is focused, because that's when we see the media coverage about evacuations, about the risks, the death, the injuries, evacuations, and so forth. But where we are focused is in this area of disaster recovery, in part because there is no handbook to disaster recovery in the same way there is for preparedness and response. There's also not a clearly defined time frame within which disaster recovery occurs. In some communities, disaster recovery may be weeks or months. Here in Colorado with the floods, it was a number of years. With our latest Marshall fire outside of Boulder at the end of December, that's going to be probably 5 years, and it's mostly residential rebuilding that's happening. So recovery can extend a very long time, and that kind of vague, sometimes unclear, and very long timeline associated with recovery makes it different than some of the other phases of disaster. So that's why we focus on disaster recovery. We also think that this is one of the opportunities where governments can learn from an event that happened and do better so that they can build to be more resilient in the future, especially in the face of changing climate and with extreme events like floods, like fires, and so forth. Okay, so I want to just briefly introduce you to the 2013 Colorado floods. I know that we're in a very different area of the country, in hydrologically and geologically. So it's important to note that this is a map of Colorado and Colorado's counties. The mountains run roughly along the Continental Divide, which is, on the east side of the Continental Divide, the water flows towards the Mississippi. On the west side, it flows towards the Colorado River and the Pacific Ocean. The Continental Divide is the dividing line between all that really dark gray area on the left of the map and the rest of Colorado. So the mountains roughly, the highest peaks roughly match that line of the darkest gray on this map. On what we call the Front Range, the eastern slope, where Denver, Colorado Springs, where most of our population is located. This is where the major metropolitan corridors are. We have about 80% of our population in this area. We only have about 20% of our water, for example. So we have a tremendous number, hundreds of what we call trans-mountain diversions that bring water from those dark gray counties from the western slope over to the Front Range to feed growing and very thirsty municipalities mostly. So in this Front Range area, actually, let me first say that in Colorado overall, we typically have about 14 inches of precipitation a year. So compared with the East Coast and the Southeast, that's a significant difference. In 2013, September 11th through September 13th, in the 72 hours in that window, a storm parked over Rocky Mountain National Park, essentially, which is where Estes Park is. It's just to the left of Boulder on this map. And it dropped upwards of 17 inches of precipitation in 72 hours. So this was an extreme event by any definition. In our study, we focus on those 3 counties at the top of the map that are highlighted in patterns, because these Boulder County, Greeley is in Weld County, and Loveland is in Larimer County. These were the 3 hardest hit counties by FEMA estimates. So this is, I'm going to zoom in here then to those 3 counties. So you can see that the line up at the top is the border with Wyoming. And then if you keep going south, if you keep going down on this map, you would get to Denver and then to Colorado Springs. So these 3 counties, we selected study communities in each of these 3 counties. We varied them intentionally on size, because when studying local governments, size is a proxy measure for capacity with resources, personnel, technical capacity, and so forth. We also varied based on the extent of damage that the communities experienced, because one of our hypotheses was that the extent of damage experience would influence the degree to which we saw greater levels of learning and perhaps more resilient outcomes after recovery and rebuilding. So these are the communities that I will talk about here, and I'll show you some demographics from these communities in just a second. So the first thing that I want to highlight, and I am more than happy to, I chose, because this is a big project, to not show you a ton of data today. I'm trying to communicate kind of the overall story of what we found, but I'm more than happy to put up charts and tables and figures if you have any questions, or to just send those along as well. So as I mentioned, one of our hypotheses was that the type and extent of damage, along with the resources that communities had in place prior to the disaster, and those that flowed in after the disaster, would be important to policy change and learning towards more resilience. So here are those 7 communities kind of outlined in terms of population size. And so here, I don't have the specific community populations at the county populations, but Boulder is just shy of 100,000 residents. Longmont is around 75 or 80. Lyons is 2,000. Estes Park is, I think, around 5,000. Loveland is in the 70s. Evans is another smaller community that's about, I think, 15, 20,000. And then Greeley is also a little bit larger, around the size of Loveland as well. So these communities kind of span different sizes of communities and and therefore different governmental expenditure levels. And so we focused on the extent to which the damages interfaced with the resources in place. So in Boulder, for example, where you have a much higher local government budget than in any other community, even though they had some pretty significant damage in some corridors, they were able to recover with insurance and FEMA reimbursement rates. If you're not familiar with disaster recovery, typically FEMA will pay 75% of rebuilding for qualified rebuilding. The state often pays 12.5%, and then local governments often pay a matching 12.5%. But that is after insurance. Insured losses are covered by either private, or in the case of governments, it's often a consortium of public entities that have an insurance pool. So after insurance, Boulder could afford to cover much more of the damage than, for example, Lyons, that had an annual operating budget of just shy of $2 million. And Lyons was one of the hardest hit communities with depending on how you count the damage to whether it's natural systems in Colorado, a lot of our communities, especially communities like Lyons and Estes Park, have natural amenities that are an important part of their local economy. So Lyons is at the mouth of the canyon going up to Rocky Mountain National Park and Estes Park. Lyons has bluegrass festivals in the summer and has whitewater tubing on the rivers, small restaurants and so forth. This is a really big part of their economy. So for them, it depends a little bit on what you include, because they include the loss of damaged by the floods. So I was talking about the major lessons related to the role of damages and resources in disaster recovery. And first of all, it's not a surprise that communities, of course, differ in the resources that they have, and therefore the rainy day funds that they set aside. Professional associations suggest having at least 3% in reserves, but 3% of $2 million is very different than 3% of $200 million. And so that, of course, varies a lot, but also, and I think very important to note for disasters is the varying levels of personnel and expertise available by local governments. So some local governments may employ personnel or who have prior experience with disasters, or for example, in the case of Boulder and Loveland, Boulder had some massive wildfires just the year before this. And so they were used to, they had experience with the disaster recovery process. And in fact, we've been talking a lot about this lately because Boulder County is, of course, coping with the latest Marshall fire. And tomorrow is the 1-year anniversary of the mass shooting that they had in Boulder at the grocery store. And so Boulder, unfortunately, has too much experience with various types of disasters. Disasters can also obviously inflict damage very heterogeneously. In Lyons, we saw this small community carved up into 6 islands. All 2,000 residents had to be evacuated for about 2 months. The flood ripped out all utilities, telecommunications, water, wastewater, natural gas lines. All of it had to be rebuilt. And in fact, it was about 4 years later that the wastewater treatment plant came back online. For almost 4 years, they were pumping their wastewater down several miles towards a wastewater treatment plant in Longmont, their closest neighbor. So we also see that in the wake of disaster, communities choose different approaches to mobilize resources. So we saw some raise revenue through taxes or fees, like a park fee or a wastewater or a water fee, those types of fees. Now, Colorado is an incredibly fiscally constrained state. We were one of the first states in the 90s to do these, like, taxpayer, we call it the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. Every revenue raising initiative has to go before a vote, before the voters. However, some communities have chosen to remove that. By a vote, they made it so that doesn't apply to municipal revenue raising. So some communities like Boulder were able to do it more freely than other communities that had not taken that initiative. So mobilizing resources through a number of mechanisms, sometimes grants, certainly FEMA and various costs shared with CBDG, disaster recovery funds and others, but also through these internal mechanisms like taxes and fees and so forth. We see that the strategies that communities use to try to increase resources that they could bring to bear on disaster recovery, they vary pretty significantly. Some communities we saw focus on developing human capacity, either through temporary employment, temporary personnel hires through some state grant funds, or through training of their existing staff. We also saw those who had greater internal resources were less constrained, so in their choices during disaster recovery. So Boulder is another great example here, where Boulder has a reputation nationally, and it's a fairly accurate one in terms of values that support sustainable building and so forth. Has pretty liberal political ideology and the policy support that goes along with that. And in Boulder, they wanted to rebuild in a more sustainable way. They wanted to do some kind of unique things in their floodplain when they were rebuilding. They could afford to take the risk that FEMA might not reimburse them 100%, whereas other communities may not be able to take that risk. So when we see the inequities between communities in terms of what they're able to do after a disaster, and therefore what the residents experience long-term in terms of living in more resilient communities and so forth, there is that inequity, because bigger, richer communities are able to take a little bit more risk in their rebuilding decisions. I next want to talk briefly about risk perceptions, because this was a really interesting thing that we explored a bit. And just to establish, we usually, the typical definition of risk perception is something akin to the perceived likelihood of an event and then the expected damage of that event. So risk perception is notoriously among the public, among lay people, are pretty inaccurate if we are just focusing on the actual likelihood and damage. But of course, there's also this idea of dread, right? There's this idea that you can be scared of something like a nuclear accident that may not be very likely, but it sure seems terrifying. And so we tend to see that those, of course, are the events that individuals are more salient, and that individuals focus more attention on. Experts and the general public tend to view risk differently, and as experts tend to view risk more narrowly and in a more quantitative way, right? The value of a human life, the likelihood that something happens in the next 5, 10, 50 years. The general public tends to view risk as kind of broader, but also in a very personal way. How will this affect me? When we examine different, actually, I'm going to table that because I'll talk about that on the next slide. One final thing that we know from the risk perceptions literature is that past disaster experience tends to influence your perceived risk of future events. So if you have never experienced disaster damage before, you tend to significantly underestimate future risk. Whereas if you have experienced damage, you're convinced that it's going to happen again. We do see some differences here. For example, it's pretty common in wildfire studies for findings to not support this general pattern, because there is quite literally a swath, a burn scar. And so there's this perception that we've already been hit, takes a while for that burn scar to heal. And so there is a constant reminder, and they think, well, now there's this big kind of safe swath near me, so I think I'm good. So we do see that vary sometimes, but overall, these are the patterns that we typically see with risk perceptions. And the reason risk perceptions are interesting to us from a theoretical standpoint is that if we have a community filled with residents who have either directly or indirectly experienced a disaster event like these floods, the local government is going to feel pressure from their residents to to act in a way that that is going to benefit the residents in disaster recovery, to help them get resources, to advocate for them. We often, though, and we're already seeing this with the Marshall Fire, we often start to see a divergence. We start to see a divergence of those who were hardest hit, if you lost a home, for example, and those who had either near misses or, let's say, smoke damage or a flooded basement, but not a full loss. We tend to see risk perceptions and policy support diverge over time as those who didn't experience as significant damage want the community to get back to the way it was functioning. They're more concerned about, broader community processes, events, community well-being, lifestyle, whereas those who experience the greatest losses tend to be still focused on what the trauma they're experiencing, because it hasn't gone away yet for them. So to put this in context with the Colorado floods, we see a number of different things from our analyses. We see different levels of disaster damage are associated with different degrees, extents to which people seek disaster-related information and actively try to participate in the local government's disaster recovery processes, public meetings, and so forth. We also see that with greater levels of damage, there's lower levels of trust in local government officials. And this is important because as we see that divergence of public opinion over time with risk perceptions and policy support, it is often those who are most affected, because they're typically the smaller in number, that don't, in years 2, 3, and so on, that don't have the attention, the ear of local officials anymore, as they did in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. So they tend to get frustrated. And so it is very likely that the reason they have lower levels of trust in local officials is because of this dynamic where local officials are having to wrestle with this tension between different portions of the community. We also know that community members with lower levels of trust in government are more likely to believe that the problems associated with the disaster are more severe, that these are essential, urgent problems that we need to solve now, whereas the rest of the community with lower levels of disaster damage may not think that they're as urgent or as severe. Second to the last point here is that community members who participate in disaster recovery processes, so remember I said that when you have greater levels of damage, you're more likely to engage in these disaster recovery processes. They tend to perceive the problems associated with the disaster as more severe if they're engaged in that collective conversation. They're also more likely to perceive greater risks of future similar events. So going to these public meetings tends to reinforce the idea that an extreme event like floods or presumably fires, other events, are more likely to happen in the future, especially as they're connected with climate change. So we see that all of this is a complex kind of web of what influences what, but we see that support for disaster recovery policies that are trying to build more resilience in a community is driven by ideology and worldview, like a lot of our beliefs. We saw that the anchor of understanding that the climate is changing and that it's human cause was a very important connection to whether or not people perceived in that events like floods would become more common in the future. And so that's not surprising, but there's this complicated web of the individual characteristics that are important to think about when we're talking about these collective decision processes, because those who are most damaged may hold different opinions, beliefs, levels of trust or support, and those who experienced less damage. And those people might be more interested and focused on kind of the collective good than those experiencing that individual trauma. So I mentioned this concept of public participation. And so I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about public engagement and planning during disaster recovery, because this was one of the really key things. And so I want to drill down a little bit here. This is one of the areas in which local governments have the most control or the most power to actually implement innovative ideas that can help benefit their communities and usher in perhaps more successful disaster recovery. So right here, these are pictures from of Lions, and then this Lions Recovery Action Plan. I'm happy to share it with anyone, but this was a really fascinating disaster recovery planning process that the small town of Lions went through. And I'm going to talk about this. It culminated in this report that I show the cover of right here. But all our interest in public participation comes from the body of literature that argues that public participation can increase buy-in for government decisions and the level of trust that individuals have in their community, and the extent to which individuals have networks in their community or social capital. So it can increase those dynamics that can be very important for trusting government and supporting government action. Public participation is also, though, on the other hand, it is hard and it is expensive. It requires well-trained personnel. It requires taking time and attention away from just putting your head down and getting the job done. And so some local governments avoid this, either because they don't have the personnel, they've never been trained and don't know how to do it, right or well, or because it can highlight some conflict and some divisions within communities. And so therefore, local government, it can be very uncomfortable to deal with and to wrestle with some of the issues that come up. It's not uncommon, for example, during deliberation and disaster recovery planning in a really sustained engagement process for something like pre-existing inequities or racial tensions that exist, or income wealth gaps that might exist within a community. It's not uncommon for those things to arise during during disaster recovery processes. So that's another reason why local governments may be hesitant to engage in public participation or a public engagement process. In Lions, I mentioned that Lions Recovery Action Plan, and I want to take a minute to describe the process that Lions went through. So I am happy to talk about all of our research methods at the end. During disaster recovery, when the night that the National Guard and FEMA have officially gave the keys to the city back to Lions and said that disaster recovery, the community is safe to return to, and disaster recovery can begin. That night, the town administrator or city manager in other larger communities stood up and asked and told the community, we won't be here in 2 or 5 years if we don't have your help. So this is going to be a community effort to recover. And so tonight we need you to sign up to serve on one of a number of sector-based task forces or groups that are going to meet regularly. They met weekly, they met sometimes multiple times a week. They were meeting even 2 or 3 years later. So that night when they had their recovery kickoff meeting, she describes to us, the town administrator did, that they had about 500 people there. And for a town of 2,000, any public meeting, that's just kind of mind-blowing for people who run public meetings, for that many people to be present. But those people, almost to a person, signed up to participate in those task forces. And they engaged in parks and open space, parks and recreation planning. They engaged in small business planning, historic places and public buildings, and on, a number of housing, a number of different sector-based little groups that eventually, you can see a picture of one group meeting here on the right, those sector-based groups continued meeting, like I said, 2-3 years later. And that recovery action plan arose out of the recommendations of those groups. And that recovery action plan built a roadmap for the most resilient community of those that we studied. So this seems to be a real critical link here. Not only did lions have such severe damage that it was not something that the technocrats, the local government could handle on their own. They really had to ask for help, and they had to do a community-wide planning process. And as a result, the ideas and the idea generation that developed was very different than what we saw in other communities. So this is one example of a small community that really used a lot of community engagement best practices without necessarily knowing it, but they used those best practices to end up in with a much more resilient plan for the future of their community. Another example is in Longmont. Longmont is a community with far greater government capacity. So there was less in the way of that kind of community engagement and discussion, but there was more in communication to the public about what was ongoing. So in Longmont, they had tens of millions of dollars of projects. And Longmont, the green line on this map that's on the left is the river corridor. And Longmont is a community where the river bisects the community north and south. If you were on the north of the river during the storm, you would have thought, it's a really bad rainstorm out here, but you might not have realized what your neighbors to the south were experiencing, where parks were destroyed, the river corridor, bridges were washed out, many homes were destroyed. And so one of the things the city of Longmont wanted to do was to ensure that going into fall and winter, they knew as Coloradans, it's going to be 6 months from now in the spring when residents are starting to come back out to their public places like parks and open space, that they are going to be frustrated at what they see. They're going to perceive it as very slow progress. If they weren't affected themselves, they might have forgotten what we've been through, the trauma that the community has been through. So we need to communicate to them in a consistently branded and clearly messaged way that we are making progress, but it's hard, so that we don't lose their support and we don't lose that, that community mindedness that often emerges after a disaster. So these are some examples of projects, of communication about projects that you would see all over town at project locations. In terms of participation and collaboration, we found that in the communities we studied, participation leads to higher levels of learning. We saw much greater learning in those communities where there was a more engaged process that was also community-wide. It wasn't just, for example, business leaders. It was also residents, or it was also education leaders. It might have also been nonprofit or faith-based organizations that were invited to the table. And so that participation really was one of the key findings from our research. And this is one of the things that I think that local governments really need to take to heart from our work. And the lesson that I would reiterate time and again is that even though it is problematic sometimes to do engagement, even though it is expensive and time consuming, that those downsides can be worth it when better outcomes arise as a result of engagement. So we also saw that groups or coalitions of individuals within communities started to coalesce in some communities like Lyons, Estes Park. We saw it a little bit in Longmont and Boulder, where they started to come together either organically or through those groups that local governments established, like in Lyons that I was describing, where those groups could advocate for projects that their neighborhood or their businesses, for example, might need and might otherwise not have the same level of influence within the community to advocate for. One thing that I haven't touched on here that was also very important in terms of engagement and collaboration is the extent to which intergovernmental relationships between municipalities, but also between municipalities and the state government, the Colorado state government, were important for learning and more resilient outcomes after the disaster. So in terms of some of the major takeaways and lessons as I wrap up, I'm first going to throw this up, but I'm going to then skip over it because my point here with this complex figure is that our goal of the book was to bring together a whole host of the variables that we studied through this project over a 6 or 7 year period. So we talked about damage, we talked about the characteristics of the disaster, trust in local government and support for local government, prior disaster experience, relationships with the state government, things of that nature. So we brought that all together to kind of create a framework for understanding how and when local governments are more likely to learn after a disaster. So the main takeaways from that figure are that public processes matter. They matter a lot. And those more deliberative processes in the most damaged communities can lead to longer term, more resilient outcomes. And that professionalized staff that have higher capacity in governments, like we saw this in Boulder, we saw it in Longmont and in Greeley, or in Loveland, sorry, the highest capacity governments, they can sometimes inhibit these deliberative and engaged processes from taking place, which is somewhat counterintuitive, but it's because they have the capacity to do it on their own, right? So when the local government itself has capacity and can do it on their own, those local government personnel and the experts in various subject areas like public works and parks and open space and others can take the lead. They can just run with it, and with resources from the federal government and others can conduct disaster recovery on their own. So this is something that I think even high capacity governments need to be aware of, that even if they are able to do it on their own, it might not always lead to the best outcomes in terms of building greater resilience. We also see that unless they establish partnerships, smaller communities often don't have power in recovery funding decisions and conversations. So we saw a number of partnerships arise where the equity for their small neighbors was brought up by some bigger players, some bigger communities that were also disaster affected. We also see this within communities where marginalized populations are often not engaged in disaster recovery decisions to the extent that local elites are. So business leaders are almost always consulted. Civic leaders are typically consulted, but it's not often the case that representatives from, for example, immigrant communities might be invited to the table for conversations about disaster recovery. We had a number of communities where there were large undocumented populations living in their communities, and it was hard, even when local governments tried, it was sometimes hard to access those residents of their communities, but some also just didn't try. So equity within communities during recovery and rebuilding is a critical consideration. We also know that risk perceptions matter. We find that experts tend to view flood risk as higher than the rest of the public. Although one of the interesting things with that finding is that they also tend to think that we can control and kind of fix the floods more than the general public, because experts in this field tend to be a lot of engineers. And so even though they believe that the risk of future floods is greater, they also tend to think that we can build our way to a safer state. So we also found, interestingly, that personal experience with flooding led to perceptions of lower future flood risk. But the really interesting in finding, we published this in Climatic Change, is that neighborhood level flooding was the most important influence on perceiving higher future flood risk. So we speculate that there is this idea that not at the broader community level, but when your neighbors, people you actually know, had been damaged from the floods, that kind of sense of communal or belonging, it may be an important factor in driving concern and beliefs in kind of increased future disaster events like these floods. And then in terms of the types of policy changes we saw in these communities, most of them were incremental. Most of them were about software. Resilience building happens continually. It is not at a discrete point in time just after an event. Resilience building is still going on. And some of this work, like with public engagement or like with educating residents about the risk of events like floods and fires and so forth, can be happening all the time, not just after an event happens. This pre-disaster work really matters during and after disasters, when residents, businesses, and others, but also especially local government personnel, are trained and prepared, and they know that these risks are possible, if not likely. We also argue, and I think it's a very important thing to think about, because I often go to a conference and I'll sit on a panel talking about community resilience, but my panel's titled some wonky thing where next door there's engineers and ecologists on a resilience panel, because we tend to narrowly define resilience as either being about the natural environment or the built environment. And we very often leave out community resilience, which is about the social environment. It's about the systems in place in communities, and it's about equity and social capital and trust and communication with government, and access to education and healthcare, and thinking about resilience in this cross-sector manner, I think, forces us to remember that it's not just about infrastructure. It's much more. And that trust we saw is very key in, after a disaster, individuals supporting what their government was doing, and having the patience, having the time, giving government the time to do what they needed to do to hopefully build back in a more resilient manner. We, of course, saw that information and education and those deliberative processes all mattered to resilience. But in the end, learning is by organizations, learning by governments and other organizations is hard. It takes resources and it takes time. It's not simply a matter of a disaster happened and therefore a local government is likely to learn from that disaster. Really, local governments have to engage in that double loop type of learning I talked about at the beginning, where they establish processes by which they're more likely to learn the deep lessons instead of only learning the lessons about procurement and software. So that's it. I want to introduce our website, which is learningfromdisasters.org. We have a bunch of information from our project there and some other projects.